GM. It's a beautiful morning. I thought I'd talk a little bit about one of the subjects that I probably get the most questions about, particularly when I'm talking to people in circles who are Christian but have difficulty in Christian beliefs really affecting their life. I'd say low-tech Christians in this case. So that's the thought process of theonomy. And if you're unfamiliar with theonomy, then that's fine. It's kind of an intro into it, and it's also a breakdown as to how we get to that conclusion. There are lots of different people who have thought processes about theonomy, and they would all say it's their particular branding or their way of thinking. But the reality is that theonomy is the result of a logical process. It's not a philosophy, so to speak. And to clarify that, a philosophy would be approaching the subject with a predetermined set of goals and a thought process that is already there to explain the object. Whereas with a logical progression, you're looking at the object itself, and you have to follow through where it would lead you. So you're letting the objectivity direct you. So in this case, we'll look at Christianity. If you're a Christian, then you're saved by grace. So what next? A lot of people will go to church for many, many years and realistically still be wondering, what is it I'm supposed to do? What is it I'm supposed to be doing day to day? How am I supposed to be living in this world? I'm saved, delivered from my sin. What does that mean? And so everybody lives by their own moral standard. And this is a pretty common thing that happens in the modern world. We talked about this on the Let's Be Real podcast. Or It's Been Real. I don't know why I said Let's Be Real. And more broadly about the concept of morality. But the reality of today is that everyone has their own morality and they ascribe to it. And you can get your morality from a variety of different sources these days. You can realistically just pick anyone that you want. But if we're going to talk Christianity, Christians, well, then they should be getting their morality from the Bible. And then that leads to a host of other questions. Well, where do you find it? Where's the best place to look for morality in the Bible, especially morality for the modern day? And you can pretty easily get pointed to the Gospels, which are an excellent source of practical understanding of morality. But the Gospels are an account of the Christ and his ministry here on earth. They're not a telling of morality. In fact, the Sermon on the Mount, which is an excellent demonstration of how a Christian is to live, can only be understood through the lens of what Jesus was speaking about, which was Old Testament law. It says, "You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemy, pray for those that persecute you." It's a powerful statement, but it's more powerful when you understand what the law demanded in terms of action. In the post-Christ economy of salvation, we can look back at the Old Testament law and we can very easily discern three different parts. So I'm speaking of that which is written in Leviticus, Exodus, Deuteronomy, and that which is fulfilled in the prophets, and that which is spoken about concerning David. The three main parts that we find are moral imperative or moral law, then ceremonial imperative or ceremonial law, and then civil imperative, civil law. And we're going to be referring to these as laws, but the reality is they are imperatives in their own right. When it comes to the moral law, this is something that's readily discernible to us in our moralistic state, where we are looking for morals, things that guide us, that don't have necessarily a tangible benefit or a tangible risk-reward strategy, so to speak. When people think about morals, they tend to think of guiding principles and things that are going to direct their way. They don't tend to think in terms of practicality. In fact, morals are often not practical. It's very easy for us in the modern day to understand the moral aspect of the Old Testament law. When we read the Ten Commandments, for instance, which is the midpoint between the two main commandments and then the rest of what I would call the civil and ceremonial fulfillment. When we look at the Ten Commandments, we can very easily understand, each of these things is a moral obligation. It's something that's supposed to be applied directly to the listener or the reader. They hear it, and then they're supposed to adhere to that inside their own life, and the application takes place more or less inside their mind, where they're able to apply the morals to the very thoughts and change how they think. However, to a Hebrew of that time, only one of those would be considered a moral law, and that would be the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet, because coveting is the root of kind of all of the other things that are going on. So God starts with the 10 commandments. He illustrates first how you're supposed to worship him with specific do's and don'ts, and then he gives specific do's and don'ts concerning how to treat one another. So there's the laws that concern worship and the laws that concern how to treat one another. And at the very end, he tacks on this kind of moral imperative of, by the way, don't even think about it. Don't in your heart desire things that don't belong to you, whether that's another man's wife or his property or riches. Anything that could be tangible, don't even desire it if it's not belonging to or you're not deserving of that particular thing. We see this played out even more when we look to the rest of the commandments that follow that. When we look at the some 315 or so commandments that follow the 10 commandments, we should be understanding a few different things. First, we should be understanding that they apply in different areas of life, meaning not every law applies to every aspect of life. Then, secondly, we should be learning that the laws are divided up based on whether they have a statute, a remedy, or a fixation of sorts. So, with that more or less preamble, we can dissect these three aspects of the law. So what makes something a moral law? So moral law, if it has nothing to do with the specific ceremony of worship, and it also does not have a civil punishment. A great example from this is there's a commandment that you are supposed to help your neighbor if his donkey or animal's fallen in the ditch, or even if he's overloaded his animal, so he's knowingly overloaded, put too much of a burden on his own animal, you're supposed to help him. However, there's no punishment listed for not doing this. That would indicate that this is a moral imperative. This is something that you're supposed to understand in your mind, and you're supposed to apply when you know it's valid. You're supposed to understand that there is no recognition in this, and there is no punishment. Partly because God's not going to waste time trying to punish through earthly means the earthly heart, the heart of man. How can we have a court that judges the heart of man? That is something that belongs to God alone, and he will judge that. But when it comes to these matters of civility, when it comes to matters of organizing your society, it is important that you have a differentiation between what is moral and what is civil. And I'll expound on that in just a second here. Concerning those things which are of a moral value, they're no less relevant in the eyes of God in terms of doing the right thing. However, they're not laws that can be applied by man to man, and that is why they are moral. They belong to an individual. The law is given to an individual to keep. That's a moral law. But then there are other aspects where we have minute repercussions for every action. What I mean by that is, if you look at the law concerning stealing, there's many different situations, and there's different levels of theft. Stealing of livestock, which could reproduce, is more damaging to a farmer, let's say, than simply stealing grain, which would not be reproducing in the same time period. So if you steal livestock, God says you have to pay back more than you actually stole, because if you stole it, presuming you used it or ate it, you'll rob the farmer of the increase that would have come of having that livestock. They would have reproduced. They would have had more. Likewise, with grain, something that sits in a larder, it's not necessarily something that's going to reproduce on its own. So consuming that would be less damaging, and God views it differently. And he has specific laws for those things in terms of how much should be repaid. And that would be a civil law. It's a law to guide the court. It's a law to guide the judge in how he is to apply the law, thou shalt not steal. Because it's different in different cases. We know it's different because God tells us it's different by establishing different punishments for different levels of theft. So this outlines kind of the basis. Then we could look at ceremonial law. And ceremonial law is law that is applied to the priesthood. So any law that concerns a priest is automatically a ceremonial law, meaning it is something that goes along with the Aaronic priesthood, meaning the priesthood of Aaron. And so in that regard, it's very important and instructive into God's mind and his personality and his expectation for us. It is not, however, especially relevant, since we are no longer under Aaronic priesthood, we're under Christ's priesthood, which is a priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. It's a different priesthood, and it has different customs and different requirements for worship. That's chiefly why we don't keep the ceremonial law, is because keeping the ceremonial law would be something you do under an Aaronic priest. But keeping that under Christ's priesthood would be to deny that he's a priesthood greater than Aaron and say he is a priesthood of the same order as Aaron, which is simply heretical. And that is why we don't keep those kinds of laws. So that's why we don't have temple sacrifice. It's why eating kosher is not relevant. Those things are all about the priesthood declaring things to be of a certain validity for worship. So then moving back to the civil law. If the civil law was good then it's good now. So the concept of theonomy is when we're organizing not our own lives and our own thoughts, but when we are organizing society, what law could possibly be greater than the law which God has set out himself, which ordinates, institutes judgments and reparations for all kinds of crimes. And people often say, well, it's barbaric because it calls for the death penalty or this thing or that thing. But the reality is now you're judging God's law based on your own moral imperative. So rather than going to the Word of God and saying, whatever God said is moral, whatever God said is correct, I'm going to follow that. Instead, you say, well, no, actually, I'm going to judge God's law based on my own modern interpretation of what I think is correct or what I think is moral. And it's just backwards. We first have to apply the morality of God to our hearts and minds. This doesn't imply that you'll be perfect, but you should concern yourself with what God considers right. And you should apply that to your own life. Then, in establishing a society, I think we should look to the civil law of God and say that's where our statutes and judgments come from. That's where the concept really leads. That's why I say it's a logical progression. We can always take the anecdotal experience, assume that you are a newly set up king of your own nation. What law system, economic policies are you going to adopt? And this is where the libertarian or anarcho-capitalist starts talking about laws and laws and laws concerning, the free market. And they would say, oh, we're minimalist in our laws. But no one's as minimalist as God is. He simply forbids debt-based economy. He simply forbids unfair treatment of slaves, which is something that we have no protection in our modern day for the slaves that exist among us now. There's no protection for them at all. Whereas God's system institutes slavery in a way that is absolutely compassionate compared to the modern day workmen that we have. That's slightly off topic, but regardless, the point is simply that God in his civil law quickly establishes what can be governed by man and what should not be governed by man. A interesting segue is simply the way in which God deals with prostitution. We would have lots of moralists who would say, well, prostitution is wrong, which I agree. Therefore, it should be illegal. And this makes perfect sense. But nowhere in God's law do you find this law. Nowhere does he say, if a woman does blah, 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 then she's to be put to death or this thing or that thing. And to be clear, adultery is not the same as prostitution. We're talking about fornication, which fornication has different regulation than adultery. If you don't understand that, that's okay. We'll get into that probably in a later episode of this. But just looking at how things work, God doesn't say, okay, prostitution is obviously illegal. You can't have this. You got to lock them up in jail or charge them a fine or something. Instead, he simply says, here's the recourse for a woman in the law. If something happens to her, she has recourse. And he lists a bunch of different situations that could happen and the status of the woman. She's a virgin or she's married. And that's it. She is either a virgin or she's married. Those are the only two statuses that are protected under God's law. Now think about this. If she's a virgin, then obviously the protection would be natural and it comes through her father's headship, and the law gives her recourse. And then likewise, a wife has recourse against all kinds of men who would abuse her. However, there is one class of woman that simply doesn't exist in God's law. This is the unwed non-virgin. This is someone who's promiscuous, not adulterous, but fornicated. And that person has no recourse, meaning that God's law gives no protection. If you were to come before a judge and say, based on God's law, this person stole from me. This person took everything I own, so they need to pay it back. The defense would simply have to show that you are actually not a virgin and you're not married. Ergo, you can't come before the throne of God and ask for judgment. Or in this case, the throne of God simply is a metaphor. You can't come before this judge and under God's law ask for justice. This is the term of an outlaw, someone who's outside the law, meaning outside the protection of the law. They can't come and ask for the law to give them vindication or justification. And that's a really powerful way of handling those kinds of individuals. And what you'll find is throughout God's law, there are many different classes of persons who, quote unquote, fall through the cracks, become outlaws, because they either won't go and receive justice and therefore they are not entitled to it, or because they're a class of person who by their actions have placed themselves outside of the protection of God's law. That's not to say that a prostitute always is going to be outside God's law. If she becomes married, she automatically regains the protection of the law. This is a natural way in which God utilizes what he's not saying to enforce an incentive to stay within the civil bounds of the law. We think of today's felony system as brutal If you don't think of it as brutal, then I don't really know where you've been living. But if you become a felon in the United States of America, you lose almost all of your rights. You lose your right to life, freedom of association. You lose the ability to vote. I would say all of the rights are underneath these ones. So you forgo all of those. And then people will look at God's law and say, that's too harsh. Yet God's law is not as harsh as this one, which places men and women all over the United States as outside the protection of the law. If you even take up a firearm in self-defense and you're a felon, it doesn't matter that it was self-defense. You will immediately be prosecuted a second time for felony possession of a weapon. And now you have double felony and you have to go back to prison. And our system has no way of forgiveness. We will readily judge that person for every single thing they do. But they have no rights. Whereas in the system of God's law, this one little area, when you study deeply, you find there's an incentive to be inside the law. And when you're outside of the law, there's no protection. But you can come back into the protection of the law. And this is just one way. It's a small little thing. I don't want people to get hung up on this little thing, like I'm trying to harp on one little aspect. This is just a microcosm that shows the wisdom of God's law and how it applies to encourage people to behave in a civil manner rather than in a discivil manner. And so theonomy is that idea of structuring our country and our society in a way that is following these laws. It would necessitate then that in a system there be no police. God makes account for that as well. The whole reason that I am bringing up this as the first topic is because the next topic that I want to tackle is how young men should be getting married today. I think Yaske has rightly said in the past the two great challenges that befall men of this generation is, what am I going to do for work, and who am I going to marry? And so my concern is not primarily with solving that second issue in this generation, but rather I want to educate young men while they're in that struggle and while they understand it, how they should be structuring their lives so that their children don't have the same struggles in terms of getting married. This is a really important aspect to how society functions. Setting out for how your children are going to find their spouses is very, very important. And you have to start now, before you're married, so you can understand the value in any given particular system for getting married. And I think you can't jump right into that discussion without first understanding why it's necessary to consult the law of God in these things, why it's necessary to start at the point A of what is moral and then what is civil disruptive. And we should keep these two things in mind, that morality, as God gives us, he gives us imperatives. He says, don't covet. That's not something that can be punished because you can't see the outward manifestation until it transgresses a civil law. Then you have a civil punishment. These things are difficult and they are intertwined. The civil law comes from the moral law, but it is not as filled out. The moral law is absolute with no variance. If you even think something, you're guilty. Whereas the civil law is meant simply for the governance. It's meant for the ability of us to look around to our fellow man and hold them to a standard so that we can have a civilization at all. Many Christians will say, oh, well, all's forgiven in grace, so we realistically shouldn't even have any kind of civil penalties for anything. This, of course, gives way to simple chaos, frustration, and things that are not very helpful. We need to have a way towards justice in terms of understanding how we can pursue justice when we have wronged someone, and also in terms of getting justice when we are wronged. God's law does this and it protects us. And in that regard, it's very, very unique and special. No other law behaves in such a manner where it's concerned with the individual so much. Moving forward, we will be talking about sometimes what is morally right and sometimes what is civilly right. understand morally is the highest standard. The morality is going to be the one where you have to judge yourself in your inner man and understand that you will stand before God and give an account for what your heart and your mind have conspired. But then there is the civil law, that is the way in which others are going to be able to judge you. One example of this might be, I would never judge someone for coveting my things. That is, I would never look at them and say, oh man, the way they're looking at my, motorcycle or whatever, that's really covetous. I'm gonna judge them about that secretly in my heart. This is God's area. When Christ said, judge not lest you be judged, this is what he meant. You're not going to judge that person about the quality of their heart. However, when someone steals my motorcycle, I'm absolutely going to judge that they've stolen my motorcycle. I don't have to worry about the condition of their heart or what's been going on. I can simply say, you stole this. You need to give it back. You need to repay. If you destroyed it, you need to replace it, and so on and so forth. These are really easy ways of judgments, and it doesn't require a heart. I would also like to point out that, as an aside, when we're concerned with God's law, almost always it is an option to forgive, meaning someone's transgressed against you in a civil manner, and you simply don't require them to pay it back. You don't require them to reparate what they've taken. And that's amazing. We have that in our modern penal system today. We have that in our modern legislative. But we don't have it in the same way. And in addition to that, there are some things that simply can't be forgiven by man because they're not sins against man. With that, I think I've said about everything I need to about this subject. And in the next little talk, I'm going to go over a little bit more about how you should be getting married. Like I said, what's moral, what's immoral, versus what is civilly defensible, and also traditions and how we should understand this. Ways in which our society can change to get away from fornication, to get away from adultery. These are some of the most poisonous, insidious crimes that go unpunished all of the time in our modern society, and they destroy confidence, they destroy trust, not just in loved ones, but in neighbors and spouses, because it's something that is simply not addressed. I think getting married without stepping into these pitfalls builds your marriage on a much stronger ground than if you fall one side or the other. With that being said, I hope you have a good day. And if I don't see you again, then God bless. And if I do see you again, I'll let you know in person.